Switch to Verizon Business and get more from your internet without paying more for your internet. Get LTE Business Internet starting at $39 a month when paired with select business mobile plans. That's unlimited data, and with it, unlimited possibilities. Start saving today with Verizon Business, ranked #1 in small business internet customer satisfaction by J.D. Power. Starting price for 25 megabits per second LTE internet plan with smartphone plan savings, plus taxes, fees, and economic adjustment charge. Terms apply. For J.D. Power 2024 award information, visit jdpower.com/awards.
Hi there, I'm Adrienne Stein, and thank you so much for joining us for Raising Me, and of course, to our sponsor, Maine Health. Summer is here, as we know, and while school might be out, teen relationships do not take a break. This encore episode is all about helping us parents navigate the tricky world of teen dating in today's always connected world. We are chatting with Caroline Botchler-Labrie, a former Maine High School Health Teacher of the Year, longtime educator. She is sharing some pro advice on everything from red flags to the influence of social media, and just, boy, she's got years of experience guiding teens. She talks about setting boundaries and recognizing some of those unhealthy patterns. Caroline also breaks down how jealousy can often be mistaken for affection and the problems with the quote-unquote Instagram perfect love, quote-unquote love, too. It is such a timely conversation for any of us parents looking to support our teens through the ups and the downs of summer romance. Check it out. Caroline, so glad to have you here. You know, we're talking about teens and dating and relationships. You're a longtime health teacher at a high school, which working with teenagers, oh my God, it seems like it could go great or be a nightmare. What is it that you love about your job and what you do?
I think the fact that we're teaching them skills that they need for the rest of their lives. Like I teach how to be a communicator, how to actually try to hear people, how to feel understood, how to manage your stress, how to just personal responsibility, overall wellness, relationships, communication, decision-making. All of those things are repetitive skills that they need to do for the rest of their life. And so I feel like I get more buy-in and I get to teach them about the things that are going to be beyond like a content. So it's not just science, it's not just math. Depending on what they do with the rest of their life, they're still always going to need the things that I teach them. So I think the fact that it's always relevant to my students is part of why I like it so much. And we can just take normal everyday things. They come in and complain about a class and we're like, all right, we're going to break it down. We're going to talk about it. Like, how can we handle this situation so that it doesn't ruin our day? So I think the fact that it's very like it doesn't feel stale ever is probably why I enjoy it so much. And the fact that I feel like these are the things that they're taking with them, regardless of what they do as a career.
It's an interesting way to look at it, right? I mean, it's life skills. And one of the life skills, you do lessons, and it sounds like lots of lessons on this about teenagers and relationships and dating, that talk about a life skill. And it's so different today than, back in our day. Right. But why is it important for parents to have open conversations with their kids when it comes to dating and relationships?
I think it really matters because I find that sometimes I ask my students, like, how many of you have talked about this at home, or we just kind of throw out some things. Like, I'll give some examples. Like if your significant other is calling you or texting you like all day, like, where are you? What are you doing? Is that normal? And like the kids are like, yes, no. And like, they don't understand how to decipher, like, where's that line? And I think kids they look around too. And so if they're just basing it off of what they're seeing, like in movies, TV, online, music videos, that kind of stuff, or even books that they're reading, like they're going to get a really muddy picture of what it looks like. So I spend a lot of time talking about like, almost like a bill of rights. Like, what is the most essential things that every person should feel in a relationship? And we kind of work from there. And so for parents, if they're talking to their kids about just like some fundamental things, like in a relationship, you should never feel this, or you should always get this. So we kind of talk about like, you should have a right to, like, I tell my students, like, they need their own identity. Like I joke about like, when like they blend celebrity names together, like Bennifer and that kind of stuff. I'm like, if people kind of say that, that means that like your identity is, you're losing part of who you are. And your relationship is the only identity that you have. And so I talk about, like you should be able to still have your own interests, have your own relationships, commitments. You need to have things outside of your relationship, because not to knock on high school relationships, but a lot of the times they don't make it.
You're kidding.
No. So we just talk about, there's some fundamental things.
Yeah.
And I think if every person went into a relationship kind of saying, these are if I can't build a relationship off of these 4 or 5 things, then it's probably not going to work. Mm. And so, obviously and I talk to my students about what does trust even look like? Because sometimes I have them make the list, what is a healthy relationship? And they're like, trust. And I'm like, and?
That's a good place to start, but there's so much more. And you hit a little bit about too on the influences, and what are you finding are some of the influences on teenagers when it comes to dating and relationships today that maybe, weren't around? I mean, social media obviously comes to mind, but what are you finding are the biggest influences for teens when it comes to?
I think one of the biggest ones is a part of it's, obviously the technology part of it, but we've just become more available all the time in the sense of our phones. So it's obviously I could text my husband right now being like, what are you doing? Right. And obviously if he's not busy, he could answer me pretty quick. So I think sometimes it's almost like this right to access your partner is something that is very different, because they send them a Snapchat and they're like, oh, I saw that you opened it. Or they have the red receipts on their phones. So there's something about how instant everything is for teens that we didn't have. Mm-hmm. For example, when I was in high school or middle school, you would go on AIM, and if that person oh, sorry, I had to log off, my mom had to use the phone.
Yeah.
So then you weren't really,
dial up. Yes.
So just the availability and the wait time, they don't experience that. So when they don't hear back from their partner, they start to think, oh, well, I'm not first.
Oh my gosh, that pressure. I mean, so couple that with, what came to mind when I was asking that question too was Instagram and this idea of creating a relationship that looks like it's all sunshine and roses. Yes. And we know that's not true, but you're posting pictures for likes or because you think it paints you in a certain way.
Right. They have this image that they feel, and I talk about this with my students about all kinds of things, and it's we talk about the unspoken influences where no one actually says them, but they definitely exist. And so it's oh, well, I'm only mature if I've done this, or I've only kind of this, what does it mean to make it, And so this kind of false sense of what does it mean to really feel like you've made it and what makes you feel accepted. And so for a lot of these people, teens and stuff, they feel like they have to have these relationships and they have to look a certain way because they see them on TikTok and they see them on Instagram. And, so they feel like if their partner, another example would be promposals.
Oh my gosh. These things are out of control.
Yes. Our school luckily isn't too bad. But exactly same thing. It's these big
pressure.
Grand gestures.
Yes. For an Instagram moment.
Right. And it's okay. And I talk to my students about that where it's how many likes is it? Oh, well, I got this many this time. Well, I didn't get this many this, I'm I said, it's you're never, and it's honestly kind of how you talk about how substances elevate your brain chemistry. Well, a certain amount of likes will elevate your brain chemistry more than another one. And
so I think too about the kids who don't get this. And so it's not just the pressure for the kids who get this and how many likes they're going to get, but that's not real life for most people. Right. And feeling like you're missing out on something adds to that.
Yes, they definitely, it's this whole, we just finished our
I'm so glad I'm out of high school for crying out loud.
I know. And because my students will ask me that and I'm I haven't posted in months. Mm-hmm. I'm and I actually don't even like notifications. And they're what? Mm-hmm. But it's you try to model that your life is more than this little rectangle that you hold. And so what, we talk about well, what do you have in your relationship when it's just the two of you? What does that person bring to you? What are their strengths? Why did you choose them? Because everybody has different strengths and different skills. And, there's reasons why you get attracted to somebody. And so we talked about, we make a list of, one of them is you shouldn't just be with somebody for how attractive you think that they are or what, what they might bring to you socially. And we talk about, like it's more than that. And because I explain, like I joke about like hot sauce. If you ate hot sauce, spicy wings all the time, eventually you'd be like, oh, this isn't that spicy anymore. I said, so you will acclimate, for lack of a better term, we say you acclimate to their hotness. And so then what do you have after that?
Yeah.
Because kids will get infatuated and they go all in. They spend all their time with that person. And then all of a sudden, all the other things start to fall away. And then they lose their identity without their partner. And so sometimes kids feel like they can't break up with this person, or they have to stay with that person because then like, oh no.
What about the friend group?
Well, what am I going to lose?
Yeah.
They feel like they have too much to lose. And maybe it is even that picture perfect relationship that they want people to think that they have. And so sometimes teens are, they just date because they feel like they're supposed to. And it's like, you don't have to if you don't want to. And like, I feel like there's some kids who do a really great job of that, where they're like, no, I'm not doing that. That's a waste of my time. No, I'm not doing that. I can really take care of myself, let alone another person. Like, some kids have a really great perspective on it, but others you can just tell like they're just so influenced and they just feel like, oh, well, I'm in high school. So high schoolers have relationships. So if I don't have one, is there something wrong with me? And so sometimes they will just get in a relationship just to like check a box.
Well, I mean, don't you remember? I mean, it's been a long time since I've been in high school, but I mean, I remember feeling like that. Now all the perspective afterwards, you're like, oh my gosh, so much time ahead of you. For the love of Pete, chillax about it.
Yeah.
One thing you talked about when you do the exercise about what makes a great relationship, clearly that, sometimes it's obvious between a healthy and an unhealthy relationship. Sometimes it's not that obvious. So for parents, what are some of the signs of healthy versus unhealthy when it comes to our kids and relationships today?
Yeah. I actually, I work on this with my students. We actually make like a gray area, and we kind of talk about like, for example, like someone telling you what to wear, right? Or if someone feels like they have to, do something with their appearance because of their partner. And so we talk about that. And, like sometimes we see kids with like matching outfits with their partners, and we're like, okay, like whatever makes you happy.
Sure.
I would say one of them is like the expectation of availability. Like, oh, sorry, I need to answer them because they've already texted me twice. And if I don't answer, we talk about that. Like, what's the expectation on their time? And like, I talk about like how jealousy can come in so many different ways. So it could be like about their time. It could be about their attention. It could be interest, and so it's like, for example, like, well, you're always spending time with your friends instead of with me. And so that can be one way. It could be, well, you had time to do your homework in study hall. So you're like, we're going to FaceTime instead. It can come across, and a lot of times it doesn't come across as like, and even to the person that's saying it, they don't realize that it comes across as kind of controlling and jealous and controlling. And I spend a really long time talking about control, and, kids don't realize like it's so much more of the unhealthy things that happen in relationships are really way more emotional than they ever are physical. And because it's all these little things, they'll use guilt, they use jealousy, manipulation. And I talk about what's called minimizing, denying, and blaming, where they, downgrade the impact of the situation, that it really wasn't a big deal. Well, I only sent you that many texts because you hadn't answered me. If you would just answer me, then I wouldn't text you like that. Right. That's minimizing, denying, and blaming, because you're actually telling that person that it's actually their fault. And so it's like it's like victim blaming. And so minimizing, denying, and blaming is a really big deal. So it's like, well, I wouldn't have shown up at your house if you had just answered me. And if you answer my text, then maybe I won't have to just I won't be mad at you. Or then they expect things in return for upsetting them. So there's a lot more of the emotional things and a lot of those mind games that happen way more. And I mean, I teach high schoolers, and, I see sometimes you see two kids that like, okay, well, they're both seem pretty good kids. But then once you add this relationship to it, some of those insecurities come out, and they're, they feel like they just do things and they don't even realize it. I think sometimes kids don't realize that, or I say, if this was happening to you, would you be okay with it? And a lot of times they're like, well, no, I don't want someone trying to do that to me. And I'm like, well, you're doing that to your partner, because when you're expecting them to just drop everything to answer you, what if you're in the middle of something like, or like, well, they can just go to the bathroom at work and answer my text. and like they don't understand that like just because you're not the priority in that exact moment, it doesn't mean that you're not the priority in
as
general,
a whole.
in general. And so there's, because of that, like that instant availability thing that kids feel, they expect things to be pretty quick. And like that whole insecurity of, well, why aren't they answering me? Who's more important than me? And so when they're saying that they're dating someone, they're basically, sometimes kids inadvertently rely on that person to like be the only one that gives them confidence. And so then that's also unfair because I'm like, you're putting all your eggs in this one person's basket and you're saying this person's responsible for my wellness,
happiness,
my happiness, my wellness, and that's not fair to anybody because then that person then was supposed to take care of their own and yours. Like that's not realistic either. And so we see this with kids where they don't realize how much pressure sometimes they put on their partners because again, it's, like they just asked me to prom. They didn't do a promposal.
Right. So that suddenly it's not good enough.
And so then you've got one partner feeling like they've got to jump through all these hoops. And if you point it out like that to someone, they're like, oh, well, I wouldn't like that. And it's like, okay, that's what you're doing. But again, with teens, they can't always see the empathy component of seeing the other side is really hard for them. So it's
like holding up that mirror.
Yes.
Right. And not everybody has you or somebody as a resource to help hold up that mirror.
Right.
And, these are life skills because what you're describing, I have certainly seen in adult relationships with friends and family members, well beyond high school. What you're describing are a lot of red flags.
Yes.
What are some of the other red flags that you have experienced or kids have come in and talked to you about and you're like, okay, whoa, that's a hard stop kind of situation?
I spend a lot of time talking about what does isolation look like. Okay. And I think this is, you hear that word and you're like, whoa, it seems like a bigger word, but it's like using jealousy to justify actions. So it would be, like, oh, I'm picking you up from practice. Well, that layer right there, that person's going to feel like it basically starts to impact those things that are supposed to be separate from their partner. Because if let's say I'm at field hockey practice and my boyfriend said that he's going to pick me up. Okay. Well, now I know that like, I'm going to keep looking, thinking he's going to show up and he'll probably show up early. And so that then once practice is over, I'm expected to just
run over.
Right. And just go. Right. And then it's less time with my teammates. Ooh. Right. And it's subtle things like that. Sometimes the fault, like how much someone checks in really does have an impact. Like the going through the phones and stuff where it's like, well, if you have or it'll say, well, if you have nothing to hide, then what are you, why are you worried about it if you have nothing to hide? And then if you, like, so sometimes kids will say, okay, fine, well, show me what's on your phone. Like, well, you don't need to. Don't you trust me? So then it's this backward, it's just.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad I'm not in high school. I also think too, like what I'm hearing, boundary setting is so critical, so much easier said than done, especially when it comes to teenagers. So like what kind of, how do you teach that? Not just setting the boundary, but then upholding the boundary.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks, or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Visit USAA.com/bundle.
Bundle savings are off total premium, not available in all states or in all situations. To qualify, auto policy must be active prior to property policy issue, subject to change. Restrictions apply. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
And that's what's really hard. So I actually teach a whole unit on communication before I start talking about relationships. So we talk about the difference between someone being a passive communicator, a passive aggressive communicator. What does an aggressive communicator look like? And ultimately, like, how is being assertive, and I almost, kids are competitive. So I'm like, really the ultimate way to win a conversation is to be assertive. And I'm like, but really assertive is not about winning, but I always tell my students limits and boundaries are self-defined. You have to know what you're okay with, and you have to feel confident in communicating those things. So I try to teach my students that if you can't do those things and you can't communicate them to somebody, then you're not really ready for what would be next, whether, in a relationship or anything like that, because if you can't communicate those things, no one's a mind reader. So we talk about how if someone's more, someone will always divert more control to the person that seems more confident. So sometimes I talk about how, because kids are like, well, why would somebody do that? How could someone just start bossing the other person around and making all the decisions? And I'll say, well, sometimes it happens on accident because the more passive person just feels happy to be picked to be on the team. And they're just so excited to feel chosen by somebody that they will just go with the flow. And then they've given that other person too much control. And who likes to give up control? Right? He said, so sometimes it happens on accident. So sometimes you're just accidentally just letting the other person make all the decisions and be in charge and doing what they want to do because you don't know whether it's, you don't necessarily disagree, but you don't fully agree because you don't necessarily know. So when we talk about limits and boundaries, and it's hard too because they don't know all of them. But I also try to teach them the confidence to say, I don't know, so I need to think about it.
And be able to, and then that's a full answer.
Say it. Right.
And you can walk away and take that time to think about it.
And being able to say, not right now. And like, being able to be assertive about it. My students, if any of them watch this, I'll be like, hey, you're going to create an assertive statement. And they're like, oh, I know. But it's so important because they practiced it on scenarios that would totally happen in their life.
Yeah.
But they have to say, based on this scenario, this person should say, like, I feel uncomfortable because I don't know how I feel. I want time to think about it.
And that's okay.
Right. And so we talk about like, you're allowed to change your mind. And if you feel like you can't communicate that, what does that really say? And so we talk about the difference between, when someone, and again, how you sometimes inadvertently give somebody the upper hand or more control. So how do you communicate with somebody when you already feel like they're kind of in charge? And so that's what's really hard for kids sometimes. And that's why sometimes relationships can just seem so imbalanced. And sometimes kids, they end up in those and they didn't even realize it. And then
that's a slow transition.
And that's, it's like, more on one side, more. And so sometimes people do it on accident and they don't realize that they've just been the boss of their entire relationship. So it happens way more than I think people realize. And sometimes a lot of times they'll kind of break up before it becomes like, whoa, one person's just like they are driving and the other person could just be in the back seat. It happens.
You know what I'm thinking too? Like you're obviously having all these conversations with teenagers. You're the cool health teacher. For parents, like we can be awkward. Maybe it feels intrusive. So how about some pro tips for parents who want to have these conversations with our kids? And, how do we do that without making it feel like we're being intrusive or like bumbling through it? Because I've had many moments where I feel like I'm bumbling through it.
You're like, hey, you. Saw you texting someone. Who was that? No, it is tricky because, kids will usually,
sure.
I have this little daily check-in. Kids give me all their I follow all kinds. Kids share with me. So in sometimes if you're ever watching TV in the same room as your teen, and something pops up, you could be like, do you think that is that how this is? And a lot of times they'll be like, no. And you're like, well, do you think that was okay? Sometimes you can kind of use stuff that's around, if you're watching a movie with them or because in those things, there's so many flaws in those relationships.
Yeah, right. And
it's all I find with my students, if I ask them to identify and I give them a scenario, they can boom, 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 identify them right away. Here on bold the bad, underline the good. Let's talk about them. And I think just kind of, letting them know, hey, if you're going to start dating, I'm excited for you. That is an exciting part of your life because it's a whole other chapter and it brings something really different to your life. So I would probably say, it's an invitation to be like, I'm excited for you to date. But I also want to make sure that you know what you deserve. And so it could be a conversation around, what you think you deserve in a relationship. And it would give somebody just some lines in the sand because a lot of times kids don't know either. So it might just be like, I hope that you feel like you deserve to be able to share and feel like you can share with your partner. And if you don't feel that way, I hope that you'll stand up for yourself, because everyone, and and if you say it in that kind of way, everyone deserves to feel heard. Everyone deserves to feel respected. Everyone deserves privacy. And you can kind of put it that way. And it's everyone deserves to not feel pressured. So if you kind of use these as what you want for them, because then it's, teens, a lot of times they want to feel that autonomy. They want to feel like they have the say. So it might be a conversation around what you hope for them when they have their relationships. And it would give them a chance to think about it too. And like, if they're in a relationship, just being like, hey, like, I hope you're getting what you want out of this relationship and that you feel respected and valued.
What if you don't like this new partner, good buddy, friend, whatever? That is a tricky one to navigate because you have that mother or father or just parental instinct. Mm-hmm. And it's like, how many situations have there been where, like, I know if you push in one direction, it makes the other thing feel a little more appealing.
Right.
So it's such a balance.
Teens that want to push against.
Yeah.
For sure.
Like what do you, how do we navigate when it just, this is not the right thing.
Right. I remember I dated somebody my parents weren't happy with. And I remember at one point, they kind of had this conversation with me of like, we just don't think this person is going to meet your needs. And that's kind of how they said it. And I was kind of already aware. I was actually in college, so I was already kind of aware. But I remember I wrote them a letter, which is embarrassing. But I wrote them a letter and I said, I'm aware that this person isn't the right person for me, but I have to do it on my terms. Otherwise, I'll always like hold that against you. Or
I got the chills. That's so true.
I'll feel like you guys were controlling me and that person wasn't always super, I needed to do it on my own. And so I think it could be a conversation of, hey, like, I think these are the things that you deserve. And I'm wondering if that person is doing those things for you. If you feel that way, okay, but I want you to think about it because you deserve the best. Mm-hmm. Or, you deserve what we've talked about. Maybe it is what we've talked about. Mm-hmm. Or just things like that. And sometimes I'll say to students, I've had in their little daily check-in, I had this student filling in this information and she'd been like talking to somebody and they weren't really, it was kind of stalling out. And I finally just looked at her and I went, you deserve to be pursued.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I got the chills again.
Right.
Yes.
And my whole class was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, it's between her and I. Don't worry about it.
Right.
I was like, if I had an answer for you, I would answer you. But I said, you deserve to feel pursued and wanted.
Yeah.
And then I just went right back to my class, like just minding my own business. And like a week later, she was like, you're right. I shouldn't feel like I'm waiting for that person to want me. And I was like, you're right. So, just like sometimes just reminding kids what they deserve. And sometimes they got it, and I always tell my students, you should learn from every relationship that you have and not just what you do or don't want, but what you also need to work on. Because if you leave a relationship saying you had nothing to improve on, every relationship should teach you something. So I always try to teach my students that too.
Being in love is such a rite of passage. And you think, so many kids, I'm sure you see, like, are very quick to jump to, I'm in love.
They're in love, always.
Always. How do we help our kids, like, really identify when love is at the center of this or we're in infatuation mode and distinguishing the difference?
Right. So I try to tell them I classify it as like high school love versus like, and I kind of explain the difference, and I'm like, real love is just this utmost layer of security. I just talk about the fact that like I can be the worst version of myself and there is no stipulation around it.
Yes.
That kind of thing. And, I said in high school, it's a different kind, it's a different kind of love where like, they're not capable of making those types of sacrifices. But you wouldn't really want them to either, So I think, when they say I love you, I'm just like, oh, it's cute.
So sweet.
Like it's not the real love, but for them, it's what's real.
Yeah.
And so I don't try to squash their dreams on it, but I usually will try to say, you will have very different types of love throughout your life.
That's a good way to put it.
And so, I'm like, this is the type of, this is high school love and that's fine. Feel your feels, but, it's totally different when, and I joke about like, when you're really, really sick, I said, did you tell him you threw up or did you tell him you were on the toilet for a long time? I said, there's different types of love right there, and so they kind of look at me like, are you kidding me? I'm like, they're like, you're going to talk about poop. And I'm like, well, I said, when someone truly loves you,
they just don't care.
I said, yeah. Or I joke that like real love is beyond, I joke that like when you fart in front of this person, you're probably a little bit elevated because they're like, wow. And I said, think about it. I said, you're holding them in or you're leaving the room. And they're like, they joke about it. But I said, if you think about it, that you're protecting a layer of yourself from this person. There's a level of vulnerability that you're hiding from them. And so when you don't do those things, it's a very different, it's like the raw version of yourself. And so high schoolers, they always keep that, they guard that. So there's a very different type of love around that, because obviously when you're willing to just be like, I don't care how terrible I look right now. Like, we're going to go to the grocery store, it's, or just that, like what we would perceive as like the worst version of yourself. Yeah. And if you're not willing to show that to that person, then, it's high school love and it's okay. But
nothing wrong with that for sure. And, sometimes in high school, love does evolve and, you hear those amazing, wonderful, lovely, lovely stories. The reality is, as you alluded to earlier, like many, usually most do break up. So let's just talk about navigating a bad breakup.
I tell them for every week you're together, you got to give yourself 2 weeks to recover.
Ooh, interesting. I got the chills.
So I kind of and I joke I'm not a math person, but it takes 21 days to form a habit.
Okay. Yes.
So if you were with that person for at least 21 days, right? They've become a habit. They have become a part of your brain where you consider that person. They are on your brain. They're on your heart. You think about them. You consider them. You text them. So when you're with somebody for a long time, you have to form new habits without them. So one time, a couple years ago, this was probably like my third year of teaching. This couple had been together for like 2.5 years, which
might
is
as well be 20 years in real life.
Right. That's a long time in high school. And they broke up. And he was like, I don't know what to do. I feel like if I talk to her, we're going to get back together. I was like, no, you can't talk to each other. Yeah. I was like, no.
Stop.
I said every time. And he's like, but it's so hard. Like when I go home and I'm after practice and I don't know what, like normally we would hang out or we would talk on the phone or we would FaceTime and like, that kind of stuff. And he said, you have to find a new habit. So I said, sounds dumb. I was like, do like 10 push-ups or floss, do some random healthy habit every time you would normally like activate that habit of that person.
Oh, that's a pro tip right there.
And it was really funny. He's like, I've been doing push-ups and sit-ups every night. And I was like, you got it. Like for 3 weeks, you've got to not talk to that person unless if you have to, not to avoid, but like, just you need to disconnect this person from your habits. And so for about 3 weeks, you got to hold strong. I'm like, tell your friends, make plans to be with your friends, keep yourself busy, distract yourself, like block that person's number, trade phones with somebody for a day. I don't know, just something. But about 3 weeks, and then your brain, just kind of releases that habit. And then if you replaced it with something healthy too,
it's win-win.
Right. So I just had this in my homeroom at a breakup. Oh. She was really bummed. And I was like, you got to give it 3 weeks. I was like, 3 weeks. And I said, I think you'll be okay. They moved on. Less than 3 weeks, but they moved on.
What I think about too is going back to your talk about availability and just in relationships and social media makes a breakup very difficult.
Yes.
For one, you've got pictures of you and your ex possibly or
the
probably.
Posts come down.
So that. And then you still, in many cases, unless you get blocked, have access to your ex's social media. So like, how do you keep your teen from becoming like, infatuated with your ex still on social after a breakup? Because that really feels so unhealthy.
Right.
But it's hard not to do. Just the curiosity. Well, what are they doing now?
How easy they can do it without anybody actually looking and seeing that they were doing it. Yeah. And sometimes I'll recommend you need to unfollow them. You know what? And maybe especially in high school, you're going to have classes with this person probably. You're going to see them around. So it's either depending on the platform, you can kind of hide, I think Facebook, you can hide people
from the feed.
Yeah.
But are high schoolers on Facebook?
I feel like my high schoolers love Facebook Marketplace.
Okay.
Out of randomness. But mostly it's Instagram and Snapchat and that kind of stuff. So realistically, the healthiest thing is you need to remove them. Like and I always tell them, you have to choose yourself, right? Because depending on how the relationship ended, I'm like, okay, well, they didn't choose you. So you need to choose yourself and you need to choose what's better for you, because at this point, that person's not going to do it. And so I'm like, you have to choose yourself. And so we recommend, like, what does that look like? How do you choose yourself? How do you form healthy habits? Like, spend time with your friends. I always joke, I'm like, what's your favorite food? Get your favorite food. Like, you have to treat yourself time and then healthy habit time. And so it is, but like the unfollow is a strong recommendation.
Strong, very strong. What can we do as parents to model healthy relationships for our kids?
I think communication is just so important because for teens, right? And like, when I teach that unit, sometimes kids are like, that's what my mom, like, oh, like, blah, 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 that's how my parent. And I'm like, okay. And I'm like, well, I said, you can't fix somebody else. And I always joke, I'm like, you cannot. I said, you are throwing stones when you live in a glass house if you're calling out other people's communication styles. I'm like, you can only work on yourself. And so, but like to model, like, what does a disagreement look like where it's constructive and it's not critical? Like if you're disagreeing about something, sometimes like modeling that in front of your kids so that they can see, like, okay, we do not agree about something, but instead of getting critical about each other. And I always say, avoid phrases like always and never. You never listen to me. You always say you're going to do this and then you don't. And so it's an it's an exaggeration. We do this with our feelings, right? You always say that you're going to take out the trash and then you never do, right? So always and never are really, like, I call them like, like potholes in your road of communication. And so, and like, how do you hear somebody without getting defensive? And I always say to my students, if someone is willing to talk to you about something that they're upset about, you have to realize how much it took for them to be willing to tell you.
Yeah. Because that can be scary.
It can be. And so when someone is really trying to talk to you, and I give them examples, I'm like, how frustrated you feel if you're talking to someone, you feel like they're not listening, or they just heard you, but they're dismissing you. And we do like tons of scenarios with conversations and showing that, like, not really listening, are you listening to understand? Or are you listening to reload your own points? And so for parents, being able to model, like listening to understand where the other person's coming from. And it's not always about winning, because if it is about winning, you're never going to win. And neither is the other person. And it's at the expense of their feelings. And people will always remember how you made them feel. And so when you're talking to kids and like modeling, how do you talk when you're disagreeing about something? And, and I know some people are like, don't argue in front of your kids and that kind of stuff. Obviously there's things that are not appropriate to
right, of course.
Kids. But even just like an example of like, who's picking up the kids? And it's like, if you're on your phone or like, put it down for a second and be like, okay, let's talk about this. Or it's even fine to say, I didn't hear you. And I'm sorry. Like I was distracted. I didn't hear you. Can you repeat yourself? Because you're modeling that you're being attentive and being an active listener, because you're showing engagement and that you're listening. And I think sometimes we're just so busy. And it's so easy to just, do that. My husband and I, we are in the car a lot. And so we model this with our kids in the car. So we'll answer and I say, all right, Olive, Violet, say hi to dad on the phone. So he knows that they're in the car. And so it'll be, you're like, all right, tell me about your day. Like, what happened today? Are you and like just showing that you're paying attention to your partner, because even those little details, like if that person sees how their parents pay attention to
and
each
care,
other,
showing care.
Yeah. And my parents always had a rule, like my parents also did some marriage counseling for like a really long time. So that was always really frustrating, because sometimes you just want to vent and be heard. And they're like, well, what was your role? And I'm like, come on. But, taking that time to like value and respect each other in front of your children, because it also gives your kids a baseline of respect that they should expect in a relationship. So,
boy, that is, I could go on with questions for another hour here, but if there was one takeaway for us as parents, we're talking to our kids, or our kids are in the middle of this right now, or we think there might be somebody, what is the one takeaway we should think about today?
One big thing that I always try to get my students to understand, and it's more of like a warning sign, like a risk factor, right? Because I teach them what would put them at risk, right? Obviously, relationships are the risk, right? But I always tell my students, if someone has an age gap on you, so what I will talk about is like, okay, what does a senior really have in common with you? Or, you know, I literally use the phrase, if you have to do math, the answer should be no. And the younger person will just surrender control so fast without even realizing it because they're just excited. Mm-hmm. And it sounds kind of harsh, but I will say to my students, what is going on in that person's life that makes them undateable to people their own age?
Ooh, whoa.
And
interesting.
We do some dating scenarios. It's actually from a program in Washington called In Their Shoes. And it's a dating violence prevention program. And one of the scenarios, it's a 21-year-old with a 16-year-old. And so the 16-year-old feels so special and chosen, right? Like they could be with all these people and they are choosing me. So they make them feel special. So I tell my students, I'm like, it is a lot cheaper to please a 16-year-old than a 21-year-old. Mm. And they're like, well, what do you mean by that? I'm like, okay, someone shows up with a $6 Aroma Joe's drink for you and your day is made, right? I'm like, somebody wants to make my day, that's a $58 pedicure. Right?
Right. And a nice dinner out. For
right.
Sure.
Exactly. And I'm like, your self-esteem is easier to build up. I said, no, if someone tries to pay me a bunch of compliments, I'm thinking, why are they laying this on thick? What do they want? You know? And I said, so when someone is older and has more either experience dating or just more confidence and all those things, I think it's just such a risk. What made them undateable to people their own age? That I joke that they have to drop down a weight class. Oh, but my kids get it, you know? And I say, well, why aren't they dating people their own age? Yeah. What's going on with them that they dropped down a weight class? And I'm like, there's nothing necessarily wrong with you. I said, you're going to feel special and chosen, but you're also just going to inadvertently give them all the control. Mm. And so when you're talking about your, like for teens and stuff and for parents, and I teach that to my students. So if they go to 11, they're hearing that. Mm. But for parents, when you see that age gap, and that's what's hard because they still have to make their own choices. And, you know, you want to respect them as their frontal cortexes are developing. They still got another 10 years. Yeah. But it just is something that really stands out. Wow. And so that conversation might look like, oh, like they're older than you. Like, how are you feeling about that? Like, oh, have they had relationships before? And it might just be like, you know, I know that they're older than you, but don't forget that you deserve to be a part of the decisions as well. And just because they have had relationships, it doesn't mean that they're in charge.
Wow. Pro tips. You'll have to come back. We'll do a part 2. Okay. Caroline, thank you so much. I also want to just mention we will have more resources on our website, which is wgme.com/raisingme. Such a pleasure. Pro status. Caroline, thank you.
Thanks.
All I'm saying is I am so glad I am not in high school trying to figure out this dating thing these days. A big thank you to Caroline. I'm telling you, she is so cool. She is one of those teachers. Her students are lucky to have her several times. I just really had some eye-opening perspective taking here. At first, just that constant connection. It was hard enough. You probably remember back in the day, but now this expectation that you're always somehow available and in some case can even see where your crush or your boyfriend or your girlfriend, whoever, is in real time. Yeah, no thank you. But these kids, they know no other way, really. And the pressure, like the promposal type things, creating big moments, great if you get one, but then if you don't, you have that creeping feeling of being less than, even if you have, the nicest potential boyfriend or girlfriend in the world. There were just so many moments in this conversation that I really underlined, but two more in particular. That guidance on breakups, build a new habit for every week you're together. You need 2 weeks of recovery. I'd never heard it put like that, but that really makes sense. You just really need to intentionally create a new habit. And then loved this. Caroline telling her student, you deserve to be pursued and wanted. Yes, yes, yes to that. Oh, okay, and then that age gap part, that red flag and the mic drop that she had. What is going on in that person's life that makes them undateable to the people their own age? I mean, come on, fair question when there is a wide gap and the inadvertent power that can be given up in that scenario. A big thank you to Caroline and to you for listening to Raising Me. I'm Adrienne Stein. This episode is edited by Megan Littlefield and produced with Nate Eldridge. Thank you also to our sponsor, Maine Health. Please follow Raising Me wherever you get your podcasts and consider a positive rating and review so others can find this message as well. Wherever you are, I hope you learned something new and get to take a little time for you.